going to give you basically the same presentation that I gave to the clerks a month ago, so that hopefully we're all on the same page with this. So if you compare these slides to the slides that are on the clerk's page, they will be the same. Obviously, there might be a little bit difference, but they're both recorded so you can see either one. The reason we did the session for the clerks in September was they did not do their annual conference this year, but we had a boatload of questions after the primary election, and most of them circled around the payroll. As you know, just like everything else, the pandemic certainly impacted how we did elections. It got delayed a month. We did almost, you could have, no reason absentee voting for the primary, which dramatically increased the roles of the people that handle that and the workload for the clerk's office. Just like everything else, we were doing things as they came up. So there were a lot of decisions made at the time, which caused a lot of issues. There just wasn't any way to prepare for that. So we realized that what we wanted to do with this presentation was hopefully going forward, we have maybe get some plans in place so these decisions are made before there's this kind of an emergency, and also basically how to deal with these issues when they do come up.
I think Janie's wanting to speak.
Oh, wait a minute.
I'm trying to get it up. Sorry.
Hold on just a second. We may be changing back again.
I'd rather stop now than getting in.
I don't see anyone going up.
I got an email that says that she is, but, or a text. Let me just ask him to do the thing.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
We got a little bit of time.
We can chat.
Zach, can you hear me? Never mind. Move on.
Okay, I'm back again. Like you really had time to miss me. So back to what we were talking about, the election workers payroll. And as we know, this year has been unprecedented. We're all been working in uncertain times and scrambling to find to make decisions and find solutions to issues that are coming up again almost daily. And there was no denying that this response affected the primary election in every single county. It was necessary for them to adapt to social distancing, the courthouse closing, election workers that were afraid to work, especially since they tend to be older. And even we had counties report where they had their election workers chosen and trained, and then someone tested positive for COVID and they had to start all over again, 2 days before the primary. So there were a lot of things going on and working against them. We know precincts have been moved and they sometimes have been combined at the last minute. We did understand the clerks were doing the best they could with the situation that they had. It wasn't easy. It got done. So, kudos to the clerks for getting the primary election through. But then I think the problems came up mainly when some of the claims for these election costs were going through, and some of these decisions that were made at the time weren't fully supported. And we want to make sure that those things are taken care of so that they don't happen during the general election. And again, the majority seemed to be related to the compensation for election workers. At the time, the clerks had reached out to the election division to let them know they were also having issues with this, and the election division reached out to Ricky and I to see if we could put something together. So the session that we gave with the clerks was in conjunction with the election division, and they were available on that during that presentation to answer questions the clerks might have. And again, that is available on the clerk's website if you wanted to see it. It takes about an hour.
So I think it's about an hour and 15 minutes.
Hour and 15 minutes to go through if you're interested. And so we're kind of hoping again with putting this information out there that we can smooth the transition and ease the way during this next general election and ongoing into the future to get so this doesn't happen again. We found there's a lot of confusion on terms used when talking specifically about compensation. So I'm going over some general definitions. This is right now we're just talking about general any employee definition. We're not talking specifically about election. So an employee is one who works for or under the direction of the employer that hires them. The employer sets the hour, the location the work is performed, the policy, rules of employment. An independent contractor, usually under a contract, performs services for the entity that they are contracted with. The independent contractor may have contractually set period of time to complete the service, but generally they set their own hours, use their own equipment and supplies, and then bill for what services they have accomplished in accordance with that contract. This is, of course, a very black and white definition. In reality, there are many variations of these situations, and it's not always an easy distinction to make. For example, a county may contract with a legal firm for legal guidance, or they may hire an attorney to work for the county. And sometimes they hire the attorney to attend all of their public meetings, for example, and do their routine work, and still have another contract for legal services outside of what their employee attorney does. So why does this matter? Well, for you guys to understand this probably better than the clerks did, the IRS cares. They have rules about reporting income. There are state and federal labor laws that are applied to employees, but not contractors. Whether the county has to pay employer taxes and provide benefits also depends on the status of the individual as an employee or an independent contractor. An employee's compensation is reported on a W-2, while an independent contractor will receive a 1099 for the payment of services over $600 in a year. An employee, for example, is covered by the state's labor laws, while an independent contractor is not. The contract would govern the payment for services, and any disputes they would have would be contract resolution. An employer would pay the employer share of Social Security and Medicare, and an employee could be eligible for benefits such as insurance and pensions, but those are not usually available to an independent contractor. Election workers are a whole separate classification of workers. Once we've got these kind of definitions in the back of our mind, and those are IRS definitions as well that we've just gone over. So the IRS has very specific guidelines for election workers and when their compensation is reported and when any withholdings are needed. I took information directly from their website to use in this presentation. However, I don't speak for the IRS, and if any clarification is needed, it would have to come from the IRS. I copied the link here for the IRS website, and there is more information and examples available on that website. So I certainly recommend you're going to it if you have questions. I did point out to the clerk that from an auditor's perspective, it is extremely important that they follow IRS guidelines. And if audited by the IRS, and counties have been audited, and they are found to be out of compliance, and there are penalties and interest to those penalties that can be assessed against the county. In the SBOA's Uniform Compliance Guidelines Manual, we require that compensation be paid in a manner that will facilitate compliance with state and federal reporting requirements. And it also states that officials and employees have a responsibility to perform duties in a manner which would not result in any unreasonable fees being assessed against the unit. Any penalties, interest, or other charges paid by the unit may be the personal obligation of the responsible official or employee. There's a lot riding on reporting this correctly. During our research on election workers, Indiana Code 33-6-6-37 was brought up, and it states the appointment of precinct election officers, those are considered independent contractors under state law. Okay, this is not the IRS code, this is state law. So this statute would not supersede the federal law. The IRS code is federal law, but for the determination of compliance with like Indiana Code 3-5-9 prohibiting a government employee holding office, these positions would not be considered employees. These positions are not considered a lucrative office for like dual office holding, and really for any state consideration, these people would be considered independent contractors when you're looking at the state statute. However, compensation for election workers does fall under county budgets and the salary ordinances. Even for the positions considered independent contractors, they do not negotiate their compensation. That is set by a governing board, and the appropriations to pay that compensation is set in budget. With that being said, there are some special considerations for election workers that we wanted to point out. We had heard that it was causing a lot of stress within the counties. The election workers are a special group of workers hired solely for the election process. They do need to be trained by the election board on their election duties, but they are not the same as other new or seasonal employees of the county. There's no need for them to go to onboarding or new employee training or have to listen to information on benefits and pensions or personal policies that don't apply to them. There is absolutely no need for an election worker to have to be trained on internal controls. And just as an added note, not all employees have to be trained on internal controls. In the statute, which is in Indiana Code 5-11-1-27, only personnel whose official duties include receiving, processing, depositing, or otherwise having access to funds that belong to the federal government, such as grants, the state government, or political subdivision, need to be trained on internal controls. Election workers do not collect any fees, they do not make any deposits, they don't even usually fill out any claims because the clerk does that. So they should not be trained, they don't need to be trained on internal controls. You will not have a finding if your election workers are not trained on internal controls. Again, there is training done by the election board, so if there are county policies that do apply to these people that they need to know about as far as getting paid or direct deposit or whatever is going to happen with that, that kind of training should be worked in cooperation with the election board training. They do need to sign necessary forms. For example, if your compensation is going to be above the limit and they need to get a W-2, you're going to need the information to complete that W-2. So there are forms that they do have to sign. So the first thing Ricky and I had to learn is how many positions are involved in elections and the statutes around those positions. We had no idea. The election division graciously provided our schooling on this part of the election process. There are a lot of moving parts within the county, and again, it's inspiring to know that all of this comes together to make elections work for our state. We're going to go over the structure of the various positions and how their compensation is determined. I think the structure helps us all get on the same page in understanding how the compensation for these workers should be processed. I understand, especially in the primary election, the volume of absentee votes was extremely higher than what the clerks are usually used to dealing with. We're going to talk a little bit about budgets later in the presentation, but this is one area where the budgets were not sufficient for the amount of additional work required by the health emergency and the executive order that absentee ballots could be filed without any reason needed during the primary election. So these election workers ended up working much longer than just election day, They came the closest to be kind of like a seasonal employee because some of them, I didn't realize that some of them were working up to 6 weeks before and several weeks after, which is a lot more than just working the day of election. This is one area where we might need further, I did not say this at the clerk, so this is a little bit different, but we might need further clarification from the IRS on this. Because again, they're not just working the election day and the day before, the day after, they're working a lot more hours. So they may view them differently. And again, they didn't anticipate the additional work that elections were going to be this year. Your absentee voter board member receives a per diem set by county council. They can also receive a mileage reimbursement that's also set by the council. The absentee ballot counter and courier have a per diem set by the county commissioners, and then they would also receive, if they're traveling, a mileage set by the county council. The election workers on election day, so these are your inspectors, poll judges, poll clerks, poll assistant clerks, your poll sheriff. These are the workers that work basically the day of election at the polling sites, okay? These are the ones that the Indiana statute calls considers independent contractors when we were talking about these particular people. This was probably not a budget issue in the same way that the absentee voters were, but we did hear of issues regarding compensation for these workers, especially when precincts had to be changed or additional training was needed. When a trained poll worker was not able to work the election. So it did cause some problems, maybe not as much as absentee voters, but it did cause some issues. The county election board, their compensation is determined by the county council. The election board sets a reasonable rate of compensation for their canvass clerical assistants and write-in counting team. So those are two positions that the election board sets the rate for. And the provisional ballot counter receives a per diem set by the county fiscal body, again, the county council. And I've listed the statutes where you can find this information because it is kind of all over the election title. So I've tried to narrow down where you can find this information. We really didn't hear about any issues for the compensation for the election board. I think that's pretty standard for the counties. It didn't change. So I just wanted to know where this compensation, or where the statute showed that this compensation is determined. What we explained to the clerks, again, is to reinforce that budgets are very important in operations of the county. The county council, for the county council, it is their main responsibility. Each county has finite resources and funds to pay for the operating and capital costs of the county, and the budget is one of the main ways to control those finite resources. In order to disperse their funds, and I know you've heard this, so you're going crazy, there has to be sufficient money in the fund, which is your fund balance, and there has to be sufficient permission to spend the money, which is your appropriation. In order for the budget to be approved, it has to be fully funded based on current fund balances and projected revenues of the fund. As we've already discussed, there was no way to budget for the disruption caused by the COVID pandemic. We could not anticipate all of the additional hours and costs that were involved. For the primary election, not only did you have an increase in the number of absentee votes, but the counties had to adapt again for social distancing at polling locations, provide sufficient PPE for your election workers, as well as new protocols for disinfecting surfaces commonly used by anyone who was voting. There is provision within the budgeting laws for emergencies and unforeseen demands on county resources, such as a pandemic and additional appropriations. We will not be taking exception to overspending the election budget during the pandemic. However, that does not mean that budgets aren't important and that there is not a need to make those budgets whole for the year and in preparation of the general election. For elections, the first step in the budgeting process is for the election board to prepare an annual budget estimate. I assume that often falls on the clerk. but based on historic costs and any anticipated costs for the next year, the board would set the estimated budget and they submit that to the county in a manner as all other budgets are submitted, so just like other departments do. However, specifically for the election, that budget estimate is submitted to the commissioners first because it has to be included in their executive budget estimate. So I've listed here on the statute where you find the county executive's budget estimate, and it specifically lists the items that the commissioners are to prepare, and item 7 is the estimated number of precincts in the county, the amount required for the election expenses, including compensation of election commissioners, inspectors, judges, clerks, and sheriffs, rent, meals, hauling and repair of voting booths and machines, advertising, printing, stationery, furniture, and supplies. So basically everything associated with the election needs to be included in the county executive's budget estimate. And again, as we've already discussed, and you're all very aware of, when we were doing budgets in 2019 for 2020, we had no idea this was going to happen, and so there was nothing built into the budget for this. The increase in absentee ballots, social distancing, and PPE, as we've discussed, the loss of the pool for potential election workers required making adjustments often at last minute. The executive orders of the governor, the guidance provided by the public access counselor, and guidance from the State Board of Accounts attempted to allow governments to continue within this environment and make allowance for some of the issues. These changes did not mean that all the laws and regulations were suspended during this time. For example, it did not eliminate the requirement to have a budget, and budgets still matter, although it did make some changes in requesting and getting approval for additional appropriations. Once the election budget is reviewed by the commissioners and added to their budget estimate, the commissioner's budget estimate is then submitted to the county council for final county approval. The compensation set by the election board and by the commissioners would be part of this budget, and the amount of compensation helps determine what the budget needs to be. This created confusion during the primary election. The clerk or election board were sometimes changing compensation where they did not really have the authority to change it, or exceeding their budgeted amounts. Again, we're not going to take exception to overspending the budget for the elections during the pandemic, but these budgets need to be reviewed before the general election so that additional appropriations can be requested where necessary. One function of budgets is to make sure we don't overspend our funds. So as much as possible, even during an emergency, everyone should be mindful of their budget. In Indiana Code 6-1.1-18-4, and 18 is on budgets, it requires that expenditures may not exceed the approved budgets. So the council approves the overall budget for the county, and then that budget has to be approved by the Department of Local Government Finance. The budget has to be advertised to the public, and once advertised, the budget can't exceed the amount advertised. Any additional appropriations have to be advertised and approved by the council and approved by Department of Local Government Finance. And the approval by DLGF will depend on the fund balance and estimated revenues to that fund. If there is not sufficient cash balance or additional revenue to be received, the additional appropriation would not be approved. Again, there are limited resources to pay operating expenses, and the budget is how those limited resources are allocated throughout county operations. We know that the COVID emergency added cost to the health department, public safety officers, and a lot of other departments as well, in addition to the increased election expenses. It is important to note that the second part of the budget work by the council includes determining compensation amounts for all the positions where the council sets the compensation. In the previous slides, we specified who, by statute, is to set the compensation for these election positions. Sometimes it is the council, sometimes it's the commissioners as part of their executive budget, and some positions the compensation is set by the election board. Changes to that compensation should be approved by the governing board that approved the compensation in the first place. That was a fairly common issue with the primary election where compensation was changed to accommodate the issues brought forth by the COVID pandemic. And these were not always set or approved by the appropriate governing board. And this caused issues in getting those claims for compensation paid. When approving claims for expenditures, the auditor has to make sure that there is sufficient cash balance in the fund to pay the disbursement, there's sufficient appropriation. And as stated earlier, we will not take exception to overspending the budget. However, they also must verify that the amount paid for compensation is in agreement with the compensation approved for those positions. We will not take audit exception if a change in compensation, other than for elected officials, is approved retroactively. So for example, if the compensation is changed for poll workers or for the per diem set by the commissioners could change that per diem after the primary and make that change effective for the primary. But the commissioners would have to be the ones that make the change if it is their responsibility or authority to set that compensation. So this is a review of the information from earlier slides on compensation. So the council sets the compensation for the election board, the absentee and provisional vote counters. So any change in their compensation would have to be approved by council on the salary ordinance. The commissioners set the per diems for the poll workers, that's your inspectors, poll judge, poll clerk, poll assistant clerk, poll sheriff, as well as vote center workers when they determine their budgets. Okay, this makes sense as they need to know what that compensation is to determine how the budget for the election cost should be set. The election board sets the compensation for the canvass, clerical assistants, and write-in counting team. However, for all of these positions, the budget is set knowing these compensation amounts, and changing these amounts affects that budget and needs to be part of the process. We understand that the emergency literally pulled the rug out from under us and all of our known structures. We can't go back and change what happened. It happened. We did the best we could at the time. However, going forward, the county can establish policies and procedures that support statute, comply with statute, and still allow for some flexibility to deal with these type of emergencies in the future. As an example, when the clerk or election board needs to combine precincts into one location, how will that affect compensation of those workers that are now covering more than one precinct? Should they receive twice the per diem, 1.5 times the per diem, 1 3/4 time? Whatever the policy is, this needs to be established before the election. That way the clerk can tell the election workers how this will apply to their compensation, and it's not going to surprise either the commissioners, the council, or the auditor's office when those claims start coming through. We're going to go over again now some of the more specifically on the IRS reporting requirements, because this is very important on when this income has to be reported. The county has to comply with the IRS requirements for reporting, or there are potential penalties that can be imposed. If there is, and again, any question on the reporting requirements, you need to pose that to the IRS. We have pulled guidance off the website that we've used for our examples. They're very general, so there could be specific things that come up that aren't addressed by these examples. You can call the IRS. I don't know how effective that is, but there are numbers available for that. You can also send a request in writing for clarification. Okay, when an election worker makes less than $600 from the county in a year, the county is not required to report any of those wages. This is obviously the simplest case for all concerned, and this is probably your poll workers, your election day workers. With the increase in hours for some election workers, they are making or will make more than $600 for the county in the year. So that's both elections together if they're working both. Okay. And we said will make. So if it is estimated that an election worker will make less than $600 at the end of the year and they end up making more, the county needs to have a process in place to flag those employees as needing a W-2 for the year. So you need to have controls in place that you're catching that information. Because according to the website, any election worker making more than $600 in a year does need to be issued a W-2, not a 1099, but a W-2. If an employee of the county works the election, the hours for the election work has to be added to the compensation from their regular job from the county to determine when a W-2 is needed for those election hours. In most cases, this will exceed $600. And so we have always recommended to the county auditors that the pay for election hours for your county employees be paid through payroll. So you already have a mechanism for tracking that. The IRS does not require income tax withholding from election workers, but there are withholdings for Medicare and Social Security after the employee reaches $1,800 threshold in election earnings. So again, for that reason, if employees of the county, they're obviously going to hit that, so they would need to be included or run through payroll. It just makes it a lot easier for you to track that. And those absentee voters, if they're working 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, they're going to be probably making more than $1,800. So they would probably another candidate to be going through payroll. So you're tracking not only the W-2, but those Social Security and Medicare payments. The last bullet on this slide is when the clerk's deputies are being tasked with election duties outside of their normal duties. For both payroll claims and for audit purposes, it needs to be very clear what duties are being performed, what pay rate is in effect and what pay rate is in effect for those duties. It needs to be clear, when are they performing their deputy clerk duties and getting paid their deputy clerk rate, and when are they performing election worker duties that are separate. And you can't know that. The clerk is going to have to provide that information, and they're going to have to document those hours and keep that documentation for audit. And if the deputy clerk's compensation is being changed, that would require council approval and change on the salary ordinance, because they are county employees and you're changing their compensation rate for the year.
I have a couple questions.
Okay.
All right. Are state and local income tax required to be withheld?
I do not have an answer for that. I tried to look it up in the Department of Revenue. I'm assuming they would follow the federal, but I can't answer that particularly. You might want to check with the Department of Revenue on that.
Okay, and the county employee compensation for working elections has to be included in the salary ordinance?
No, if they're getting a separate, we're going to talk about that. If they're getting a separate election pay, it would not. But if you're talking about changing their compensation, so that's why I said specifically deputy clerk. So if the deputy clerk is adding additional duties to his or her work, and that's giving them additional compensation, that has to be approved through salary ordinance. So we're going to go through some examples. I hope that we'll make it a little clearer, and then we'll come back to that if it doesn't clear it up. So here's our example one. We have Betty retired. She is hired to work the primary election as a poll clerk. She has consistently worked elections for her county and will probably work this fall election as well. Her total compensation for both the primary and the general election will be $550. She does not need a W-2 at year end. Okay? She's not over that threshold, so she can be paid her compensation. We'll talk about how that payment is done, but she can be paid her compensation. You do not need to flag her for a W-2. This is the most simple and the most direct. Number two, we have Susie Coed. She decides to work the election since all her classes are online. She has the time. And she works as an absentee vote counter. And due to the increased number of absentee votes during the primary, she works more hours than usually required. Her pay for the primary is $950. Because she has earned more than $600, she is going to need a W-2 at year end. So unlike Miss Betty retired, who doesn't need it, Susie does need that W-2. She has to be flagged to get that, okay? She would have no withholdings, but she would still need the W-2. Now, if it turns out that what she is on track for, making more than $1,800 for both the primary and the general election, she's going to need to pay Medicare and Social Security. So that's what I'm saying. She may need to be paid through payroll, so you have a proper way to track that. We have, and this is what I think addresses your question earlier, we have Joe County. He works for the county health department. The courthouse is closed for the primary election, and he decides to help out and work as a poll inspector. He has earned $300 for election work. Now, his election earnings are below the $600, but you have to consider his compensation from the county for his regular job. And when added to his election earnings, his total compensation from the county exceeds $600 for the year. So his election work earnings, that $300, has to be included on a W-2. It could be a separate W-2, or it could be added to his compensation as a health worker. Now, when you're paying Joe, your authority to pay him for his health department work is on the salary ordinance. Your authority to pay him the $300 is what is set for election work. So you're not changing his compensation, because you're not changing his compensation as an employee of the health department. You're just giving him compensation as an election worker. It gets a lot muddier when it's clerk deputies, and that caused a lot of problems during that. Whether you were actually changing their compensation as a deputy clerk, or if maybe they worked in a separate department and they're more like Joe, they're just working as a poll worker on the day, and so they have two separate sources of that. So you're going to have to work with the clerks, and they're going to have to communicate with you, because you have to know what work they're doing and where the authority to pay them comes from. Whether it's an increase in their compensation, or they're just doing additional election work that's totally separate from their job as a deputy clerk.
Another question.
Okay.
All right. Can the same employee work as an absentee worker and as a canvas clerical assistant? Would this be a violation of internal control?
I don't see it as a violation of internal control. Now, whether it's legally allowed, I don't know. That's something we'd have to run through the election division, whether you can do both, but it's not going to affect your internal control. They could have, if those hours are separate, the thing with all of this, and I think caused a lot of confusion, you cannot be paid twice for the same hour of work, okay? So if they're doing both jobs at the same time, they aren't entitled to both pays, but those are totally separate. If they're working, election day on one and the day after for the other, so that their hours are separate, then you could pay them both separately, and that would not, again, it's not going to affect your internal controls other than tracking that information. But whether or not they can hold both positions, I'm not sure of. That's something we can run past election division. Which goes back to what we were talking about when your deputy clerk is working, where, if you have a clear situation where you do, like with the health department, courthouse is closed, the deputy clerk has nothing to do with elections, but is willing to work as a poll worker on that day, that's totally separate. If they're taking on additional responsibilities for the absentee voter board or something like that, that's being added to their work as a deputy clerk, then that is a change in their compensation for the deputy clerk. And so that's why that would need to be changed. So you just really have to be clear where they're working. So it is possible, if we had questions come up, if you are paid for the day off, the courthouse is closed, so you're getting holiday pay or vacation pay for that, you can work and get your vacation pay. That's not a violation, because you're using actually leave time, plus you have hours working. But you cannot work 1 hour and get paid from 3 different sources for that 1 hour of work. it has to be what you're actually working on. So if a position like a deputy clerk is working more, they need to be logging what hours they're working and what position they're working in when they're logging those hours. There are 3 different ways we're going to discuss to get the compensation paid for election workers. Okay. As a county auditor, it's your responsibility to audit all of the county claims and vouchers prior to allowance and payment. For personal services or compensation, you have to determine that the salaries or weight of wages are in strict accordance with those fixed by the county council or the board or officer having jurisdiction over that compensation. When the claims received do not line up with those established salary ordinances, budgets, per diems, etc., and that causes a stop in the payment until those variances can be researched and determined. And so that's what's slowing down, as you're well aware, that's what's slowing down getting these election workers paid. Okay, and then on top of that, you still have to determine that there's sufficient funds and appropriation available to make the payment. We did note that Department of Local Government Finance provided guidance on additional appropriations during the public health emergency, and so this would have been in effect during the primary election, that made allowances for additional appropriations to be, that process to be streamlined and approval to be gathered or postponed because of the inability to do the meetings and get everything lined up that you needed to. But again, that doesn't mean that the budget is no longer important, okay? It just means that the counties had a shortened or streamlined process so that necessary emergency expenses could be made and operations could continue. Okay? And again, as you're all very aware, this was a very steep learning curve for all of us, and as we tried to make a plan to get through the pandemic and to continue operations. So sometimes we need to practice patience as we work through and get some of this resolved so that people get paid, because it is very important if they've worked the hours that they get paid for the work that they've done. The PRE2 is really the workhorse for election compensation, and this is mainly for workers on election day. This allows the clerks to summarize the payments needed. For other positions that may not be county employees, they might have to use a Form 17. We'll go over that. And then for employees, we recommend that the payroll claims be used to make sure that all the reporting and withholding requirements are met. This is a screenshot at the top of the PRE2. The election division received requests to alter this form. And we did discuss that with them, and they just brought that to our attention. But there are considerations to be made in implementing the change. First of all, it's not an easy process to change a state form. It would be difficult and if not impossible to complete it before the year is ended, and we really don't want to change it during the election year. It takes a lot more reviews and work to get a state form approved. Okay? And we didn't really want to jump to making changes if they were not necessary. So what came up during the primary was that clerks were modifying this form to add positions that are not pre-printed on this form, especially if that person worked more than the election day. And we do not recommend that. Use the form as it's printed. But it is possible that these workers were not going to make more than $600, and there should be a way to compensate them, and if it's under $600, not have to flag them for a W-2 or pay them through payroll. Okay. And that may be why the 17 could be useful if it's somebody that's not already printed on this form. This form is standard. Use it in the way it's prescribed. Okay, so this is a 17. You're all familiar with this form as a means of requesting payment. It is could be possible to use this form to pay compensation. When we discussed earlier about independent contractors being paid under a contract, think attorneys, consultants, software vendors, they could be paid using this form. The one issue we heard about, which might apply to this, and again, if there's others, you can bring them to our attention, was mechanics that were used during the election. Title III does talk about mechanics in general, getting them to work because of electronic poll books and electronic voting machines. But it doesn't really address their compensation or even how they're supposed to be paid. So that position is not on the PRE2. Again, statute doesn't really specify who determines the compensation for this position, so we're not really sure, and neither was Election Division, how that was determined. Okay. They work for the election board, so depending on your county's policy, there might be a contract with the mechanic, or the election board may set a per diem or compensation rate. If there is a contract, then the Form 17 could be used to pay the compensation. Copy of the contract should be attached to the claim to support it when it's submitted to the auditor's office. If the per diem or compensation is set by the election board, that information also needs to be made available to the auditor so they have the information before these claims are being processed. That might be in the election board minutes or some resolution that they've done. If the mechanic is not paid by contract but would receive less than $600, the 17 might be the best way to pay them, because you are not going to need to withhold, you're not going to need to track them for anything. However, if they're going to be working more than 600, and I have no idea what they're getting paid, you would still need to have to track them for issuing a W-2, and payroll may be a better option for that. Again, it's going to be county specific. If there are other positions besides this mechanic position that we're coming up, let us know, and we'll work on that. So for county employees, we have always recommended that they use payroll to pay for them, because not only do their election wages need to be reported on a W-2, there's going to be withholding for Medicare and Social Security that are required above the $1,800. So payroll is the best mechanism to track the wages and apply the appropriate withholdings. It is possible to issue a separate W-2 for election wages, so they get one for their regular compensation and one for their election wages, but that would be a county decision. So what we told the clerks was, you have to remember the county auditor is auditing all of these claims to make sure that the amount paid ties to an approved compensation amount. If the approved compensation amount is not already available to the auditor, so they've got their salary ordinance or their board minutes or a copy of the contract, you need to make sure, the clerks need to make sure that they do submit a copy of this documentation with the claim. And as additional notice, we spoke earlier, if the compensation amount has changed, make sure that the appropriate board has also approved the changes and that this approval is provided to your auditor's office. An appropriate board is the board that has been given statutory authority to set the compensation. It might be the council, it might be the commissioners, it might be the election board. But make sure that they've made the approval of any changes to that compensation. And even though there have been changes to the additional appropriation process, the budget is still important and should still be considered with any expenses that would exceed the appropriation line approved in the budget. Any additional appropriations have to be fully funded, and again, there has to be sufficient cash balance to pay these costs. Additional appropriations needed for the general election should be sought before the election. The election board should evaluate their budget that they've used to date, what will be needed, and request any additional appropriations. So this one, I titled Lessons Learned. Hopefully there are lessons learned. I think the very first line on there is for everything that we've dealt with this year. Communication is key. Keep the lines of communication open. This has been even more challenging during COVID because y'all may not be in the courthouse together, so you've been having to rely on phones and emails. But make sure those communication lines are open. Make sure everyone is on the same page as fully as possible. Again, the clerk should be providing those approved changes to support their election claims. The budget should be reviewed by both the clerk and the election board to make sure that budget is still working and there are sufficient appropriations, and if not, additional appropriations have been requested. The clerk should be considering any unanticipated costs in reference to the budget. If something came up in the primary and it looks like it might come up in the general election, try to adapt for that as much as possible in advance. If more of the election budget was spent for the primary, again, additional appropriations might be needed before the general election. So try to plan ahead. If it was necessary to combine precincts and you needed to change the per diems as a result, make sure that the appropriate boards have given approvals or set schedules of payment for workers in combined precincts. Having plans to replace election workers if there are COVID-related issues that prevent them from working. Having plans to set up another central office for the election if the courthouse should be shut down for COVID. These are all plans that should be worked out before the election actually gets here. We understood everybody, and I mean everybody, did their best under very trying circumstances to get that primary election. We get that. It was hard on the clerks, it was hard on the auditors, it was hard on the governing boards. And that emergency is not fully ended and may continue into next year, although hopefully not. Please don't allow the adaptations or the changes that were made for emergency situations to become the way we always do it, okay? So what worked in the primary election for 2020 does not set a precedent for the rest of the time for elections. So be sure you keep that in mind. Are there any other questions?
The only thing I have is, it's the cat.
Thank
I forgot about the cat. I'm sorry. Is that they would want to know if they could get in writing your clarification explanation regarding employees not receiving compensation from 3 different sources, and clerks submitting a clear outline of the job duties that a deputy clerk will be performing on election day that will be over and above their regular job duties.
I think it's in one of the county bulletins about logging your hours for different jobs within that. I can send you that, but yes, we can put that.
And as far as I know, I haven't seen anything else come in. Let me check one more time. No? Oh, wait, there's no, okay, this way. All right, we were audited years ago by the Department of Labor, and the county received a write-up for failing to pay election workers through payroll.
Department of Labor? I have not heard of that. We'll check into it. I'm not aware of that, yeah.
So.
And there's not a problem paying them through payroll as long as you're following, reporting requirements. That's still going to be a county decision. And that's another thing. You want to establish those decisions before you're in the middle of it, so everybody knows going in what those policies are.
I think that might be it. I love the cat. Oh, wait, got another one. Okay, the treasurer will be working as an inspector on election day. Should her election day compensation be added to her payroll?
It should be paid through payroll. It does not mean that her salary ordinance has to change, because these are election wages that she's getting, separate from what her duties as the treasurer, because you can't change treasurer's pay, but those are separate. So, but there can be one W-2, there can be 2 W-2s, one for her regular duties and one for her election duties, but it should be paid through the payroll.
That might be it. Oh, wait. Wait. Oh, I gotta switch. My computer's lagging. Nope, not about this. Sorry.
Is that it?
I think.
I realize that this caused a lot of stress in an already stressful time period for everybody involved, and we were, again, just trying to try to provide some clarification and some guidelines going forward, so again, nobody's caught off guard. And again, I can't stress enough, I hate to see relationships be destroyed over something like this. So keep your lines of communication open, be flexible, be reasonable from both sides, and try to get as much pre-planning done as you can so everybody knows how it's going to work. And thank you for listening.
Yay. Okay. Can I have you like unshare, stop sharing, or
Wait, I have to figure out how to do that. Stop sharing. Okay, stop sharing, Lori.
actually what I'm gonna do?